Hey guys, welcome back. Today is another beautiful, sunny, but very cold day. But we are out here in the garden and we are going to get a head start on spring planting, starting out with planting 2 new trees to our garden. Our bare root peach tree that we picked out together, and then we also got a persimmon that we're going to be planting. And we're not planting these in the garden, we're actually going to plant them in these beautiful new containers that we just picked up. Now you might ask yourself, why would I want to plant a tree in a container? And there's so many great reasons to do that. And I love a planted tree in a container. One, I think it adds instant height, volume, and drama into any sort of space in your garden, whether it's going to be in your landscape, in your patio, here where we're putting it in our cut flower garden. It's just going to draw you into that space. One of the things that I always talk about is planting trees in corners of your garden that will draw your eyes to that space. By planting this peach tree over here in the corner of our cut flower garden, I want people to be interested back here and think, what is that tree back there? What are those little fruit back there? I want to continue drawing people to the back corners of my garden because there's so much wonderful things going on back here. So again, it's a way to just draw people in. The other reason why planting a tree in a container is always a good idea is because it allows you to move it whenever you want. Obviously, planting trees in containers, it's still going to be heavy, but it's not going to be as tough as digging up a tree and moving it. And you know, some of the trees that we plant in containers, we plan on taking those trees with us when we move into our new garden someday. So by doing this, it allows us to enjoy the tree now, enjoy the shape of it and the fruits of it and all of the good stuff about having a tree, and we're able to take it with us when we're ready to move. And lastly, the other reason why I want to plant more trees in containers, especially back here, because that is going to add instant texture into your garden. So we often talk about textures and shapes and all of that. Well, a container will do the same thing. This will act as a different shape and texture into your garden. So I think it's always so interesting when you're walking through a beautiful garden, and you often see this in French garden, English gardens. They'll have beautiful potted up lemon trees or oranges. And I just want to bring that element of gardening into our garden more and more. So those are the reasons why adding trees into containers is always a good idea. Of course, you can use any sort of container. When we were just starting to garden, we used to plant a lot of our trees in our air pots, which I've done a video on. We've also done them in plastic containers, the big black ones. But now I'm also thinking about the aesthetic of my garden. So I'm going to choose to do these big, beautiful terracotta pots. I also wanted to mention, we picked out these containers at Farmington Gardens. We're actually there the other day, and I picked one and Sergey picked one for the persimmon tree. I'm opting for something that's a little bit more tapered down. One thing I want you to keep in mind when you're picking out a container is you don't want something that has an edge that comes inwards. Why? Because if you're trying to transplant that tree or take out that tree, if the edges come in, you're gonna have a real hard time pulling that out, and you'll probably most likely have to break your container. And if that's not a big deal to you, that's fine. But I always like to have something that's completely open at the top like this and not come inward. I'm going to start out by doing this bare root peach tree, which I've already been hydrating. You typically want to hydrate these for about 15 to 30 minutes in a bucket of water before you plant them. Not 100% necessary, but it sure does help them. It's kind of dried out a bit since we're getting ready. So let's get planting. The tree that we're planting again is the early Alberta semi-dwarf peach. It needs full sun. It gets 12 to 15 tall and wide in 10 years, so it's kind of a slow grower. And it's hardy down to minus 20 degrees, which is great because we are in zone 8B, so we're never going to get that cold. So I know it's going to do well for us, and we are going to be pruning this as well. But let's go ahead and get this planted, and I'm going to show you the proper way of planting trees in a container. All right, first things first, you want to make sure you select a container that has good drainage. You can see it has a nice big hole in there. So we're good to go. All right, the first thing we're going to do is put in our irrigation. Now, I am not ready to tap in to our line quite yet, our main water line that is going to water these. But by having the irrigation in now, you're not going to have to hand water these, which is really nice. I mean, if you want to hand water, that's fine, you can skip this part. But adding the irrigation now is critical so you don't have to worry about it later on. I am just going to close this with a little cap at the end because, again, I'm not ready to tap into the main line yet, so I don't want soil to get in here and clog this up. So I'm just going to leave it closed off like that, and then we will feed it through. And you want to make sure it's long enough to your nearest line. So kind of measure ahead of time so you have plenty of space. And I'm just gonna pull it out. And this is like the biggest hack in my opinion. Like, not having to water your containers, especially trees like this, is like the best. It saves you so much time. And the other thing I wanted to say, wherever you plan on putting a tree in a container in your garden, plan to plant it there so you're not trying to move this across your garden. So wherever you're gonna place it, make sure you're where you plan on leaving that container. So let's see, I think this looks pretty good. It's going to come out, and then I'm going to add another piece of irrigation that has holes every 6 inches. And then that will create a circle around the top of the tree where I'm going to have the water drip coming through. And I wanted to do it that way and not with just individual emitters because I plan on planting things around this tree as well. So that is there. And now we're going to put a little barrier at the bottom of our container just to protect the drain hole so it doesn't get clogged up with soil. And I learned this from my friend Kate. Actually, a lot of people have told me about this, and I just haven't been doing it, but now I have. So you're just going to take a piece of landscape fabric and you are going to lay it down just like this. And actually, I'm going to make a little slit to go around the irrigation. All right, so just like this, so do you see how it's kind of protecting it? And now you're just going to add some rocks to that area. Now I am just going to cut this another piece, and the goal is to kind of sandwich this together. So the way you would do this if you didn't have the irrigation is you would put this down in your container. So this is your container. There's the hole at the bottom. You're going to add your fabric, your rocks, just like this, and then you're going to fold this over like this. But because I have the irrigation coming through, I am just going to make a little hole like right here and feed the tube through this and use this as my cover. So this will be my fold. So just like this. Okay, and then we will just tuck that in like this. Perfect. And now we can start adding our soil. The reason why we want to do this is because we don't want soil to wash out and clog the hole. I've had that happen before where I didn't follow this step, not all of the time, but this is really kind of like an assurance that it's not going to happen, or it's less likely to happen. So this will allow you to still have good drainage without clogging that hole, especially if you have these in a patio or a deck. You don't want all of that runoff of the soil to come below your pot. It's just going to muddy things up and kind of get your rocks or your wood really dirty. This allows everything to stay nice and clean. And it's funny because when I was in Brazil shopping for my grandma for containers, they were trying to sell me a bunch of landscape fabric and these little, gosh, what were they? They were kind of these drainage balls.
Terracotta balls.
Terracotta balls, yeah, that's probably the proper name. But they're selling them to me because everybody in Brazil has patios, and usually you'll see a lot of potted trees and patios. And that is one way they keep everything nice and clean and neat and prevent that soil from running off and getting everything dirty and again, clogging it. In terms of your soil, you want to use a good potting mix that has a lot of drainage. That is key. You don't want to use something that is going to retain a lot of water, especially because these are going to be on irrigation. I am not going to check on these constantly. So So I know if I use a good potting soil now, not only is that going to be beneficial to my tree and the plants that I plant around it, but it's going to allow the water to drain through properly. If you buy something that's really dense, you want to make sure that you add pumice or perlite, really get it like lofty and loose, because that is going to do best in containers. You can also do a mix of half compost and half potting soil. I like to add a little bit of compost when I'm planting big containers like this. I don't have any on hand. So what I'll do in the springtime is come in with a little bit of compost and just top dress it a little bit. That's fine. The main thing is to use a really high quality soil. And especially if you are planting something that you plan on eating, I'm going to make sure I use something nice and organic, and that's going to be really good for our tree. So let's get planting. We will get our level out, make sure it's nice and leveled. Okay, so we just added our first little layer here of your soil. Looks good. I'm thinking this way, because this branch will go out that way, this one will go out this way, and this one will come into the garden. The other thing you want to do is protect the graft, which we talked about when we were buying these trees. If we can, we want to make sure that graft is facing the north side, because that is going to protect it from the hot afternoon sun. So I am going to see, I think right here is perfect. All right, let's continue adding a little bit of soil. That looks good. We're gonna measure again, but before we do, we are going to add a little bit of Biotone starter fertilizer. I use Biotone anytime I dig a hole in my garden, or I'm planting a tree or a shrub or anything in a container, because this is like fairy dust. It's magic fairy dust, and it helps establish the roots of your plants and trees. So I always recommend using some of this. You don't need to go crazy. I measure with the heart. There are specific instructions in the back, but you don't need to go too overboard. All right, now that we have that, let's look at our tree. I want to make sure it's nice and centered. Is that good? So now we're going to add a little bit of soil, and I might have Strigay do this because I want to tuck in soil in, because we want to make sure that we don't have air pockets, especially when you have bare root trees like this. You see how there's going to be so many air pockets in here. So I want to make sure that I'm really just tucking and fluffing the soil in there as much as I can, so we don't have anything left open and exposed. So now we're doing this in stages, just again to make sure that everything is tucked away and there's no air pockets. So it's nice to do this with two people. That way one is pouring and the other one is kind of fluffing up the soil, but you can certainly do this on your own. I also think it's so great to plant trees in containers, especially if you don't have a lot of rooms. If you have a small garden, don't let that discourage you from not having trees. You can still have trees, but just plant them in a container. There's so many options in today's market. You'll find something that works for your space. All right, this is the final layer. One thing I wanted to say is to leave a little bit of space on the top to add a layer of mulch or compost, because what is happening now, we have this beautiful potting soil, but it has a lot of pumice, and by adding mulch or that layer of compost, everything is going to be nice and dark and beautiful. So it's going to elevate the whole look of that potted tree even more. Think about your garden. When you add mulch, it's like instant gratification, and it's the same thing here. We're not just looking at potting up a tree, but we also want to see aesthetically how it looks in our garden. So by adding a thin layer of that compost or that mulch, it's going to be even better. Now for me, I'm going to be planting this up with annuals in the springtime, so I'm going to leave it bare like this, and then I'll come in and just add a little bit of compost once we get those annuals planted. But again, that's going to just take that whole look of the container even up a notch. All right, we're gonna do the same thing here. However, this is not the permanent home for this container. So I'm just gonna put it here temporarily because we're actually gonna be moving a tree. So it might go in that space, but we're close enough. When you're cutting your irrigation tubing, just cut longer than what you think you'll need because oftentimes you might change your mind or you might need a little bit more room. Same thing, we're gonna make a little cut to go around our irrigation tubing. This also helps prevent the roots of your tree or whatever you're planting from growing into your landscape because it actually will do that. So this kind of prevents that from happening, especially when you have containers directly in the landscape like this. What I like to do is also create a little platform. That way we can level things off a little bit more, but we're not doing that today because we still have to move this tree. But that is also something to consider. You can actually put these on like, I don't know, what size rock? Like for this container.
Just a foot by foot.
Yeah, yeah.
Any kind of natural stone.
Yeah.
Anything that looks nice.
Yeah, anything just to kind of elevate it a little bit so it's not directly on the soil is going to be nice.
Drainage, all that good stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Better drainage, all the good stuff. All right, now we're gonna check to see if this is deep enough. I think we're right about there.
Oh, we're good, yeah.
Yeah.
We'll work it in if we need to.
Yeah. So the difference with this tree, this is a potted tree. This is not a bare root. And this is the persimmon tree. All right, well, here is the roots. They don't look too bright, so they don't look that great, but hopefully they'll get better once we transplant it in here. But you just see how they're dark. I'm just gonna tickle them a little bit.
Ooh.
Get a little bit loosened up. Now, when you're up potting trees like we are, you don't wanna go too big of a container. I plan on having in these for quite a few years. So I think this is good. I'm not going to have to up pot it in a while. But you can see that there's a pretty good gap. It's not too large. You want to go a couple of sizes up when you're planting a tree from its nursery can. So I think this one looks pretty good. And I'm not too worried about the orientation of this one because we're going to move this container. I just want to make sure it's nice and centered. It looks centered to me. Now let's add a little bit of biotone in here, and then we will get this guy planted. Biotone smells like success. All right, there we go. Now let's backfill her up. We should be good to go. Even though this is not a bare root, I'm going to continue just fluffing that soil around and making sure everything is nice and snug. In terms of how long you can keep a tree in a container, it really depends on the size of the tree. Ultimately, trees do want to get planted out, but you can honestly keep trees in containers for years and years and years. You might just have to do a little bit of root pruning, which means you're going to have to lift it up, prune up the roots, and drop it back into the container. But I've seen trees planted for 15, 20 years in a container and they're thriving and healthy, but those do require you to come in every few years and just do a little bit of root pruning to keep it happy. And you also want to make sure you're amending your soil with things like compost. We will come in with some citrus tone, so a slow release fertilizer. The one I like to use is citrus tone from Espoma. So we'll come in every spring, add a little bit on the top and just kind of work that in. and that will be really nice. Again, especially if you're planting something that you plan on eating, don't use synthetic fertilizers, use organic. It's going to be better for you. It's going to be better for the tree, the soil health, especially when you use something quality. That's also really important, and that's also going to attribute to the health and the overall happiness of your tree, especially if you plan on leaving it in these containers for a long period of time. And just for reference, what I plan on doing in the springtime is removing this tip, putting in a barbed tee like this. We'll put it right here, and then we will feed these two pieces on either side, just like this. Oops. All right, just like that. And then this one will go in here, and this will sit right around our tree. I might just widen this up a little bit because I am going to plant annuals around these. So I might just come out a tiny, tiny bit. But ultimately, that's what it's going to look like. All right, now Sergey is going to make a couple of cuts to the trees so we can begin shaping it now. So this is the persimmon. This is a Fuyu persimmon. It gets 15 to 30 feet tall and wide. It's hardy down to minus 10 degrees. And it's our second Fuyu persimmon that we have. You guys know we already have another one next to our shed.
You know why we bought this? We bought it because it has perfect shape. There's a couple branches that I do want to cut a little bit. That is this one here, because we're kind of crossing with the main. So I'm just going to bring it back and cut it below that node. I was kind of debating whether I want to cut here, have the branch come out this direction and leave this branch here. But based on experience with our other persimmon, once it begins to bear fruit, the branches do begin to kind of come out. So I think if I cut here or cut here, leave this branch, it's not gonna be proportioned. So I'm gonna go ahead and just sacrifice that branch.
Okay.
And that way, when this one will bear fruit, it'll kind of pull it out. This one will go out, and it will be a nice, even tree. Up here, I don't think we need to do anything. Maybe next season, we will prune this one here. But just for the sake of not shocking it too much and getting a little bit of fruit, we're going to leave it.
So with our peach, we're also going to be cutting that central leader. We talked about this when we were picking it out. We want to cut that central leader to have it open like a wine glass, because that is going to allow more light into the tree, and peaches love that. So I'm just going to go ahead and have Sergey snip that central one right there. So we have three main, very funny. There we go. And see, nice clean cut. And now look at the shape of it.
I don't want anything to grow into the tree. I know this is growing in, and actually I will probably leave it for the season. But next year, I think what we're going to do is we're definitely going to chop this and encourage the growth to go outward, to leave the center open. Same thing with these. We're going to leave them, but next year we will cut it back. But for this year, most important, center, open it up.
All right, so here is the final look. I think this turned out so beautiful. I cannot wait to come in and get this all planted up, but I think this is going to be such a great addition to our garden. We will treat our potted trees the same way we do with our other trees. We will prune them in the late winter time, early springtime. We're gonna make sure we're gonna spray these, especially with the peach tree. We talked about how these tend to get fungal viruses. So I am going to try my best to make sure that this doesn't get leaf curl like our other peaches have in the past. Again, in the springtime, I'm going to come in and add just a little bit more fertilizer on the top before we get our annuals planted, just to top dress it a bit, give it some more slow release organic fertilizer, and then we will get this all planted up with some pretty things, which will just add even more to this container. But if you step back, I just think it's such a beautiful addition to our cut flower garden. And I love it so much. Just imagine how beautiful this is going to look with all of the little flowers. You see there's all these little nodes that are going to bud up with little flowers and then eventually fruit. I think it's just going to look so stunning. And here is the persimmon, which I absolutely love. This is the container Sergey selected. This one is a little bit taller than the other one, but they still have that same look. So it's kind of keeping a cohesive look in our garden. We're really into these finishes right now, I think they just look a little bit like old country and I think they're just so stunning. But eventually what I think we want to do is move this to where our maple is right over here. So we will be shifting this guy over here in the springtime. All right, guys, well, I think that will do it for today's video. It's getting so chilly, but I'm so happy that we got out here and we got these trees planted up. These are going to be beautiful addition to our garden. And we also have some other trees that we're going to be planting up in containers in the side garden that I'm really, really excited for. I would love to hear your guys' feedback on whether or not you have potted up trees in your garden and what does that look like? Where do you have it? What kind of trees do you have experience with in containers that have done really well for you? Anyways, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today in my garden, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.